Hello and welcome to The World on Fire. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Remy Cross, the man with the face for radio and a voice for silent movies. So this week, we're going to be talking about some protest movements. And my hope in doing this is really to be able to share some of the knowledge and insight that I've gained in over a quarter century of participating in as well as studying social protest movements. Oftentimes, when we see coverage of protests, protesters, and general social change efforts, there's a lack of deeper understanding of the dynamics that really drive these social phenomena. And that's fine, right? Journalists who tend to report on this are trained as journalists. It's unfair to expect them to be experts on activists, activism, and protests. But my training is in the hows, the whys, and the whats of protest and activism. I am a former professor of sociology and criminology, and my scholarly work has focused on radical extremism and grassroots movements, with a particular focus on right-wing movements, as well as the role that new technology is playing on enabling or inhibiting protest movements. If this is your first time watching us, I usually start with a brief rundown of some activism and social movement activity that's been in the news, and provide a little bit of context on that before moving into a deeper dive. And this week, we're going to be talking about what I am calling the pain of activism, which is a particular subset of what social movement scholars sometimes call biographical consequences. And linking that to some of the student protest movements that we've seen in colleges around the occupation of Gaza and the war that Israel is waging there. But before we get to that, I want to just jump into the rundown of a couple of things that have been in the news, starting with separatist movement in New Caledonia. This is probably not one that most folks have had on their radar. New Caledonia is a colonial possession of France. It is not an independent state, although it does have an indigenous separatist movement that has been pushing for New Caledonian independence. This hit a wrinkle recently when the French colonial government made an effort to expand who might vote to include more European French, as well as people who have not been there for very long. This understandably upset the indigenous population, who saw it as a form of sort of vote packing. And as a result, a younger generation of activists than those that had previously been active engaged in some highly contentious protest activity that left 6 dead. As a result, the French cracked down and imposed a curfew, mobilized a large number of security forces, and most interestingly, shut off social media, particularly aiming at TikTok, which they blamed for fomenting a lot of the violence. I want to talk about this one and just highlight it briefly because I think it runs counter to what a lot of people think about sort of the 21st century, which is we don't have colonialism in colonies anymore. And that's just not true. There are still numerous indigenous independence movements. They just don't tend to get covered as much anymore because we tend to see colonialism as a sin of the past and not one that is currently ongoing. And you can see there is a number of countries, and this is not by any means a comprehensive list, but a number of countries that are still colonial overlords over populations that do not have full vote and franchise rights, including the United States, which has a number of colonies where we tend to use those as places to exploit loopholes in labor laws. So maybe we'll talk about that sometime soon. Moving on, I want to briefly touch on a number of stories that have been in the news about Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the possible relationship that may be developing between these two men. Let me caveat this first by saying that for the most part, I am not interested in covering the horse race of national electoral politics. That's what my friends who are political scientists are for. And there's plenty of people who already cover this territory. I don't want to become yet another politics, channel. However, there is something interesting about this particular relationship, in the sense that Elon Musk is not a political candidate. He is not somebody who has always shown an interest in electoral politics, but he is somebody who has a lot of characteristics of a charismatic social movement leader. As well as has been pointed out by some, almost a cult-like following that he cultivates. He has a massive appeal that reaches across racial and class lines and really draws in a lot of young men from different backgrounds. His sort of bootstraps capitalism story that he likes to throw out there, and his grind set, crypto, all that sort of stuff, AI embracing, has a particular subset appeal. And I'm sure anyone who's spent time on the platform formerly known as Twitter has encountered some of these Musk bros and their particular form of, I'll say toxic masculinity that really embraces this sort of hustle culture that Elon is emblematic of. Now, where I sort of highlight this and want to, put a pin in it to draw your attention to it is the fact that this is a population that tends to skew, or historically has skewed, libertarian, and generally is not a factor in electoral politics, in the sense that they either don't vote, seeing it as sort of a fool's errand, or they will vote for third party. If we do have an alliance between Musk and Trump, there is an interesting question of whether or not Musk will bring these followers with him, and if they will mobilize to vote, which could have an effect on the election in November. Because again, this is a block of voters who is not normally considered particularly gettable. But you have a sort of, a charismatic movement-like leader who does seem to some extent to be able to guide and influence the behavior of his followers. So something to keep an eye on as the election heats up. Jumping to the story that you probably have heard of in the news, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito has been a very bad boy. His wife got him in trouble first by hoisting two flags, one an upside-down American flag, a symbol that is often seen as a distress symbol, and the other a flag that is sometimes called the Appeal to Heaven flag. This is one of these places where traditional media narratives sort of fall down on it. There is a lack of context that creeps into a lot of the coverage of these flags, and a lot of sort of bad faith argument, particularly around the same people who are more than happy to tell you that a swastika does not necessarily mean Nazis. And yeah, swastika is an ancient symbol. Appeal to Heaven flag is something that dates back to the Revolution. Context is key. Swastika doesn't just mean that. An appeal to heaven isn't just a Revolutionary War flag. And flying the American flag upside down has become contextually something that is affiliated with the January 6th Stop the Steal claims by Trump that there was election interference. So Alito further put himself in the doghouse by in a secretly taped conversation making claims about the need for godliness in the judicial and in the civic realm. Now, you take these bits and pieces, and I think one of the things that happens is they don't necessarily get connected to the underlying movement activity that's happening here. So let me do that really quick here, because what you are starting to see around Alito is a disturbing amount of comfort and proximity to a particular type of Christian nationalism called Christian dominionism. So if we look at the appeal to heaven flag, right, the context here is important. And what I have here, for those of you that are watching the YouTube video, is a number of images taken from both January 6th and recent Trump rallies that show this flag. This is a flag that I think, unless you are a historian, you probably do not have a lot of exposure to. For those of us that have studied right-wing extremist movements, this is a flag that started popping up really in the mid to late 90s. After the sort of surge of post-Oklahoma City libertarian anti-government movements. Throughout the aughts and the teens, it became increasingly associated with Christian dominionists, and is now considered sort of a lesser-known anti-government pro-Christian dominionist symbol. And if you don't know what Christian dominionists are, I will probably talk about them in another episode, but the short version is they are a group of folks who believe that the Bible is the only document that really should be dictating governance, that the Constitution is not necessarily necessary, and that the best run state is one which embraces the Christian values outlined in both the Old and New Testament, and that non-Christians should either leave the state or not be given full rights. So, and unless you think that this is sort of a fringe group, a lot of the people who are very close to the Donald Trump campaign have made public statements supporting Christian dominionism or have ties to that movement. So this is very much a live issue. And to see a Supreme Court justice, comfortable with these sort of extreme views is more than a little alarming. So let's move on to the final thing to talk about today before we get into some of the dynamic I want to talk about, which is the narrative that the campus protests are winding down, or coming to a close, or dwindling. And this is all, if you look at the headlines here, these are all very sort of soothing, calming framings of the protest movement that basically are meant to evoke the sense that it has run its course and it's really over now. I would say this is at best a misrepresentation, and at worst sort of an effort at carrying water for authority figures that really wish this to be the case. What is true is the bulk of focus on these movements has shifted away. They have dropped out of the media cycle. But that does not mean that they're not still ongoing, that there are not still occupations, negotiations, and active protests that are occurring on college campuses. But this represents sort of something that any longtime activist is very well acquainted with, which is the sort of the pain and consequence that comes with being an activist. If you talk to seasoned activists, they'll tell you that it's not the pain of batons or pepper spray, of fighting with counter-protesters, or being given a rough ride after an arrest that hurts. The pain is more of an existential one that comes from seeing the world turn away once they've sort of seen the cause, the grievance, and moving on to something else. It's the pain that comes after there is a media focus and attention and maybe even fundraising and some political activity around a cause that then fades away as the cameras move elsewhere, after the media cycle moves on, when there's not as many eyes on them anymore. And this is both, again, an existential pain because it represents sort of a drawing back from the causes that many activists prioritize, but also it represents a period for activists of increased danger and risk in a lot of ways, because of the things that often will happen to activists when there are not cameras on them. And I just want to caveat this by first saying that there is a narrative out there. It is often pushed by right-wing media personalities, but there are left-wing versions of it as well that claims that people who engage in protest activity are doing so because they're a paid actor, or that they're doing it for clout, which... or that there is this professional protesting, that people are making a living by going to street demonstrations. None of this is true. The people who engage in protest activity are often doing so at great risk to themselves, with little hope of compensation beyond maybe recognition that they are trying to make the world a better place for themselves and those around them. And this gets to this issue of sort of pain because it first of all, it tries to delegitimize the legitimate grievances that many protesters have, but it also elides really the consequences that come from engaging in protest. And I've got again, if you were watching on YouTube, I've got an image up here with the name of a couple of different government programs that really targeted and harassed protesters. People who are doing things that are particularly opposed or oppositional towards the government or those in power often have consequences that result in job loss, or result in a criminal record, or expulsion. In the case of a lot of these campus protesters, they're likely facing expulsion from school in a way that can really derail or upset their career life path. Because again, once the cameras move on, the sort of, I don't want to call it harassment, but the low-level pressure campaign that always seems to be present against a lot of activists starts up, right? University administrators, now that the cameras are gone, can bury students in tedious disciplinary hearings that slowly wear down any remaining and lingering public interest until sanctions or expulsions can be handed out without much notice. For a lot of these activists, especially if this is their first time, they're about to find out that protesting in the early part of the 21st century means that you have put yourself out there publicly, and that there are counter-movement groups that are more than happy to go through hours and hours and hours of footage to identify anyone who was participating in a protest, and then dox them, and dox their family, dox their kids. This is something that's happened to me as well as a lot of other protesters. And then there is the state sanctions, right? Anyone who's arrested faces the potential for prosecution, and there are laws on the books that specifically target protesters and do things like restrict movement or impact the sorts of jobs and opportunities that may be available to them in the future. And I just want to sort of recognize that everyone who came out to protest against the Israeli invasion of Gaza here in these campus protests, as well as other protests, really did risk something, and it's sort of a disservice and a dishonesty to frame protesters as people who are self-interested and only want attention or money when they are legitimately risking quite a bit to go out there and stand up for what they believe in. Okay, well, that has been the World on Fire for this week. Again, I am Dr. Remy Cross. I have my contact information there. If you are watching this on YouTube, there are some links to some resources that talk about domestic, and again, this is mostly U.S., although there's a Freedom House and the Amnesty International reports make mention of some international contexts of protest and activist suppression. But if you're interested in learning more, there's some links there to get you started. My contact information is there, and I guess this is the part where I say you should like and subscribe because YouTube. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.